I had always avoided old cemeteries at night, but when my cousin Daniel disappeared, I knew I couldn't ignore the stories any longer. He was last seen near Elmwood Cemetery, a sprawling, overgrown burial ground on the outskirts of our small Pennsylvania town. Locals called it cursed, whispered about strange sightings and voices at night, but Daniel, ever curious and reckless, didn't believe in ghosts. That was his mistake. I parked my car on the cracked asphalt road leading to the cemetery entrance. The gate was rusted, swinging slightly in the cold autumn wind. Fog curled over the ground like smoke from an invisible fire, shrouding the tombstones in a ghostly veil. The streetlight at the road's end flickered and buzzed, doing little to push back the darkness. I gripped my flashlight, checked the batteries again, and stepped out. The cemetery stretched out before me in waves of crooked headstones, moss-covered statues, and twisted trees. Elmwood was massive, over 20 acres, dating back to the 1800s, with a long abandoned section in the rear where the ground had shifted with age and neglect. Families had moved away, graves forgotten, and the wrought iron fencing around the oldest part had collapsed in places. I knew Daniel had been drawn there, chasing some story he'd overheard about a crypt hidden in the back, supposedly the resting place of a family who vanished mysteriously in the late 1800s. I followed the gravel path, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the fog. Every step made a crunching sound, echoing oddly in the dense night air. I called Daniel's name softly, letting the sound bounce off stone and air. At first, only the wind replied. Then, faintly, I heard a whisper, too soft to be my imagination, too precise to be random. Help! My pulse quickened. I followed the voice to the edge of the old section. Tombstones leaned like drunken soldiers, some half sunken into the earth. The grass was overgrown, brushing against my knees, wet with dew. Then I saw it, a broken mausoleum, half hidden behind a line of gnarled oak trees. The door was hanging loose on its hinges, swinging slightly as though inviting me inside. I swallowed hard and approached. The air grew colder, damp with mildew and something worse, like the smell of decaying soil and old wood. I pushed the door with my shoulder. It groaned on its hinges. Dust rose in small clouds, catching the beam of my flashlight. The inside was darker than the night outside, shadow pooling in the corners. Niches lined the walls, some empty, some holding marble coffins with names worn smooth by time. "Daniel?" I called, voice trembling. The silence answered me first, thick and oppressive, then came the softest sound, the scrape of metal on stone. My stomach lurched. Something had moved. I edged deeper, flashlight swinging. A coffin near the center of the mausoleum was cracked open. The lid tilted at an unnatural angle, just enough for something to peer out, or something to escape. My mind screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't leave Daniel. I crouched and peered inside. It was empty, except for the faint outline of something pressed against the bottom, like a shadow refusing to leave. Then I heard the whisper again, sharper this time, closer. "Help me, please." The voice was thin, quivering, desperate, almost childlike. I froze. My flashlight flickered, throwing the crypt into complete darkness for a moment. In that blackness, I felt it. Eyes on me, cold, hungry, impossibly patient. I couldn't move. The whispers became a chorus, layered and overlapping, surrounding me. I could hear footsteps where there were none, and the air itself seemed to breathe against my skin. A sudden crash of movement behind me made me spin. My light landed on a small figure, pale and thin, wearing a tattered white dress. She looked about 8 years old, her hair dark and stringy, eyes wide and unblinking. She raised a hand, trembling, pointing at the back of the crypt. Her lips moved, forming words I couldn't hear, but her eyes screamed the message. I swallowed hard and followed her gaze. At the far wall, another coffin sat slightly ajar. The air around it seemed to shimmer, almost alive. The whispers intensified, circling me, tugging at my senses. I reached the coffin and lifted the lid gently. Nothing inside but darkness. But the air was heavy, thick with cold and despair. My flashlight beam caught a glimpse of something moving beneath the coffin. I stepped back, heart pounding. "Daniel!" I shouted. My voice echoed oddly, swallowed by the shadows. No response. Then a faint giggle, high-pitched and hollow, came from the back of the crypt. I turned and the girl was gone. In her place, a shadow moved along the wall, twisting unnaturally, coalescing into a humanoid shape. The shadow lunged. I stumbled back, almost tripping over the broken threshold. Cold air struck my face, icy fingers brushing my hair, crawling down my neck. The whispers became screams, layered and unbearable, echoing inside my skull. I ran for the door, shoulders slamming into the rusted metal, but the hinges groaned and resisted. Something was holding it closed. I heard Daniel's voice then, faint, hoarse, calling my name. Over here! The sound was near, behind a small alcove near the wall. I crawled toward it, flashlight beam quivering, and found him sitting on the floor, shaking. His eyes were wide, darting, unseeing. I saw her. She wanted me to follow, he stammered. I didn't. I tried to leave, but she wouldn't let me. Before I could respond, the shadows around the coffin thickened, curling toward us like black smoke. The temperature dropped sharply. My breath came out in white clouds. The whispers turned into guttural, screaming voices, begging, pleading, angry. I grabbed Daniel, pulled him toward the door with everything I had. The crypt seemed to resist, the air heavy, thick, almost tangible, pressing against our chests. Finally, the door gave way. We stumbled out into the foggy night, gasping, shaking uncontrollably. The sound of the crypt settling behind us was deafening, metal scraping stone, faint sobbing, whispers fading but never gone entirely. We ran through the fog, past headstones, over broken paths until we reached my car. Driving away, the streetlights became blurry through tears and fear. We didn't speak until we were out of sight of the cemetery. Then finally Daniel whispered, "She was trapped." And she didn't want to be. In the days that followed, things worsened. I would hear faint sobbing in my apartment at night, footsteps in the hallway when no one was there. Objects moved from where I left them. Daniel's behavior became erratic. He refused to sleep alone, speaking constantly about the girl, about shadows, about whispers. I even saw a reflection in my mirror once, not my own, but a pale child's face hovering just behind me, silent, watching. We contacted a local historian who specialized in Elmwood Cemetery. He told us of the Weatherby family, a father and his 3 children who had died under mysterious circumstances in the late 1800s. The legend claimed the children's spirits were restless, bound to the crypt until someone acknowledged their suffering. No records explained why only one child seemed to manifest that night, or why she had sought Daniel. Months passed, and the hauntings never fully stopped. The sounds in my apartment became less frequent, but every October the fog rolls in, and I swear I hear soft whispers in the night. Daniel left town shortly after, unable to cope. I stayed, trying to rationalize, to understand, but rational explanations fail in Elmwood Cemetery. I never found the courage to return to that crypt. I keep a flashlight by my bed, just in case, and I avoid the old section entirely. Sometimes, when the wind is just right, I swear I see a pale figure at the edge of my window, waiting, watching. I know she isn't angry anymore, just patient, still hoping someone will help her find peace. I don't know if she ever will. Story the end. The town of Redfield, Ohio, was small and quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. And the old cemetery on the hill had always been a subject of hushed conversations. It wasn't that it was particularly large, but it was old, dating back to the early 1800s, and there were rumors, whispers of people seeing things they couldn't explain. I never paid much attention to such stories until that October night, the night that changed everything. I was 18, a senior in high school, and my friends Danny and Lisa had dared me to spend the night in the cemetery. "It's haunted, old man," Danny said with a smirk, tossing a flashlight at me. "You want to prove you're brave, or are you chicken?" Lisa, ever the thrill seeker, had already set her backpack down near the far end, full of snacks, blankets, and her camera. She wanted evidence. We arrived around 9 p.m., the moon a thin crescent in the sky, barely lighting the cracked gravestones. The wind whispered through the trees, sending dry leaves skittering across the ground. The air smelled faintly of earth and decay, the kind that clings to your shoes after walking through fresh grave dirt. I tried to joke, tried to mask the knot in my stomach, but both Danny and Lisa looked uneasy too. The cemetery was more expansive than it seemed from the road. Rows of stones, some leaning precariously, others broken entirely, stretched back toward a dense line of trees. Shadows pooled between the stones, thick and dark, as if the night itself had weight. I turned on my flashlight and swept it over the nearest gravestones. Most were small, simple markers with names, dates, and short epitaphs, but a few of the older ones caught my attention. One read, "Mary Whitlock, 1821 to 1845. Another, partially eroded, seemed to say, Jonathan Crane, 1804 to 1832. The dates made me uneasy. People buried here had died long before anyone I knew had been born, and yet somehow it felt like they were watching. We found a large oak near the center, its branches twisted like skeletal hands, and decided to set up a base there. Lisa spread out a blanket and started fiddling with her camera, trying to capture paranormal energy she claimed. Danny and I stood nearby, the wind rattling through the branches above us. At first, nothing happened. We laughed, told ghost stories, and joked about shadows moving just outside the light. But around midnight, things started to change. The air grew heavier, almost suffocating. My flashlight flickered. I glanced at Lisa. Her hands were trembling as she adjusted the camera. Danny's usual bravado had vanished. Then we heard it, a faint whisper. Low, almost imperceptible, coming from the far side of the cemetery. We froze. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Danny nodded, eyes wide, but Lisa was already standing, pointing toward the sound. "Someone's there," she said, voice shaking. Or something. We stepped cautiously toward the sound, the crunch of leaves under our boots loud in the oppressive silence. The whispering grew, though we couldn't make out words, only a low, drawn-out hiss, like air passing through a cracked skull. As we neared the source, I saw it, a shadow moving unnaturally fast between the gravestones. Not like a person, not like any animal I'd ever seen. It stopped suddenly just ahead, and then we heard the whisper again, closer this time. I swallowed hard, heart hammering in my chest. "We should go back," I said, voice barely audible. But Danny shook his head. "No way. This is it. This is real." Lisa, ever the curious one, stepped forward, camera raised. "Maybe it's just the wind," she said. Her voice was trembling, though. She clicked the camera, and the flash went off. For a split second, the world was illuminated, and I saw it clearly. A man, or what appeared to be a man, stood among the gravestones. His clothes were tattered, gray with dirt, and his skin looked stretched over his bones. His eyes were dark hollows, and his mouth hung open unnaturally wide, as if he had been screaming for decades. His hands were clawed, fingers long and thin, gripping the air like he was trying to pull something from it. We all froze. The wind died. The night went utterly silent. And then he moved. Jerky, unnatural, dragging one foot as though he was partially submerged in the ground. The dragging sound cut through the air, wet and heavy, like fingernails scraping over stone. I screamed, the sound echoing across the cemetery. Lisa dropped the camera and grabbed my arm. Danny tried to run, but tripped over a gravestone, cursing as he hit the ground. The figure didn't chase us in a normal sense. It just moved closer, inexorably, its hollow eyes fixed on us. We stumbled back to the oak tree, but the shadows seemed to stretch and twist around us, forming shapes, faces, hands that weren't really there but felt terrifyingly real. I could feel the cold now, seeping into my bones, a chill that no amount of jackets could protect against. Lisa was sobbing, Danny was pale, and I was paralyzed, caught between fear and disbelief. The figure reached the edge of our light, and then, as suddenly as it appeared, it vanished. No sound, no trace, just gone. We didn't wait to see if it would come back. We ran, crashing through the gravestones, leaves scratching our arms and faces. When we finally reached the gate, the mist seemed to pull back with us, and the cemetery settled into quiet darkness once more. The next day, we returned, cautiously, to see if anything had changed. There were no signs of what we had seen. No footprints. No disturbed earth. Lisa insisted the camera had captured something, but when we looked at it, the memory card was corrupted, completely unreadable. Word spread in town about strange occurrences at the cemetery. Some said they had seen figures moving at night. Others reported whispering voices in the fog. One elderly man told me that Old Redfield Cemetery had always been known for restless spirits, particularly those who died young or tragically. He mentioned names I hadn't heard, people buried in unmarked graves whose deaths were never fully explained. Weeks later, I had nightmares. I would dream of dragging feet behind me, shadows stretching into impossible shapes, and hollow eyes staring from the mist. Sometimes I would wake and hear a soft whisper, the sound of air through broken teeth, though my house was quiet. Lisa and Danny had similar experiences. We didn't talk about it much, too afraid to admit it, yet unable to forget. It wasn't until a month later that I realized something worse. Every night at the same time, I would hear it, The dragging, slow, and deliberate, outside my window, circling my house. It wasn't just the cemetery anymore. It had found me. I moved my bed away from the window, tried leaving lights on, tried sleeping elsewhere, but the feeling persisted. Hollow eyes watching, the pit of a mouth silently calling. Danny and Lisa moved away shortly after graduation, unable to cope with the lingering terror. I stayed behind, but every October I drive past that hill and the cemetery looks exactly the same. Fog rolling low, trees twisted, shadows deep. And sometimes, just at the edge of the road, I see it, a figure dragging its feet, hollow eyes fixed on me, waiting. I've learned one thing. Once you see it, it never stops watching. Old Redfield Cemetery is not just a place for the dead. It's a place for the living to be remembered, to be haunted. And some of the dead, like the man we saw that night, aren't content to stay in the ground. I tell this story now because someone should know. Don't go there. Don't linger near the gravestones. And if you hear the dragging in the mist, don't look back. Once the hollow eyes see you, you belong to them too. Story the end. It was a cold October evening when Ryan and his friends, Matt and Jenna, decided to explore the old Hillcrest Cemetery just outside their town in Virginia. Rumors had circulated for years about strange occurrences there. People hearing whispers, seeing lights in the middle of the night, or spotting shadowy figures among the graves. Most dismissed it as local legend, but curiosity had a stronger pull on them than caution. The cemetery sprawled over several acres, with rows upon rows of gravestones ranging from simple markers to elaborate monuments. Many of the older stones were worn, cracked, and covered in moss, their inscriptions nearly impossible to read. An iron gate, rusted and half-collapsed, served as the main entrance. Beyond it, a thin fog had already begun to settle over the ground, curling between the gravestones like restless fingers. Ryan led the way, his flashlight cutting a narrow path through the fog. "Come on, guys," he said, trying to sound confident, though his teeth were chattering. "This is just a cemetery. Nothing's going to happen." Matt rolled his eyes. "Easy for you to say. You're always the brave one." Jenna followed quietly, her hands stuffed into her coat pockets, eyes darting nervously between the gravestones. She had always been more sensitive to things that went bump in the night, but she didn't want to admit fear in front of the guys. As they moved deeper into the cemetery, the temperature seemed to drop and the fog thickened. The silence was almost complete, broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. Jeremy felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. "Do you guys feel that?" Jenna whispered. "Feel what?" Matt asked. "That, like we're being watched." Ryan laughed nervously. "It's probably just the wind or a raccoon, nothing more." But then they heard it, a faint scraping noise, soft and deliberate, that coming from somewhere to their left. They froze. "Probably just a branch," Ryan said, though his voice lacked conviction. They continued walking, but the scraping followed them, moving parallel to their steps. Every now and then they would see something out of the corner of their eyes, shadows shifting where there shouldn't have been any. They reached a section of the cemetery that was older than the rest. Gravestones here were ancient, some completely toppled or buried under layers of moss and dirt. One particular grave caught Ryan's attention. It was a tall, blackened headstone, cracked and leaning at a dangerous angle. The inscription was barely legible. Margaret L. Holloway, 1892 to 1910. The stone seemed colder than the others, almost absorbing the light from their flashlights. "Let's check this one out," Ryan said, stepping closer. As they approached, Jenna shivered violently. "I don't like this, Ryan. Something feels wrong." Ryan crouched down to examine the grave. The soil around it was loose, as if something had been disturbed recently. He reached out to touch it, and the instant his fingers made contact, a cold gust of wind swept through the cemetery, extinguishing their flashlights. "Shit!" Matt yelled, fumbling in the dark to turn his back on the wind. From the blackness came a faint whisper. It was soft, childlike, almost melodic. "Leave. Now." The voice made their skin crawl. Jenna stumbled backward, tripping over a root. Ryan grabbed her arm, pulling her to her feet. "We need to get out of here," Ryan said urgently. They turned to run, but the fog seemed to thicken, slowing their movements. Shapes moved in the corners of their vision, figures standing just beyond the reach of their flashlights, barely visible yet undeniably there. Then they saw it, a small figure, maybe 7 or 8 years old, standing near a toppled tombstone. Its face was pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were dark voids that seemed to suck the light from the world around it. The child tilted its head, watching them silently. "Run!" Matt shouted, and this time they didn't hesitate. They sprinted through the fog, stumbling over gravestones and tree roots, their breaths coming in ragged gasps. Behind them, the whispering grew louder, joined by a low, hollow moan that seemed to come from the very ground beneath their feet. When they reached the gate, the child floated a few feet above the ground, blocking their path. Its mouth opened, emitting a high-pitched laugh that made their ears ache. Ryan shoved past it, dragging Matt and Jenna with him, and the instant they crossed the threshold, the figure vanished. They didn't stop running until they reached the safety of the streetlights at the edge of town. Their clothes were soaked with sweat, hearts pounding, and hands shaking. Over the next few weeks, strange things began to happen. Ryan would wake up in the middle of the night to see shadows moving along his walls. Objects in Matt's apartment would shift places, and Jenna reported hearing faint whispering when she was alone. Then came the packages. Ryan received a small, broken music box with no return address. When he tried to wind it, a distorted melody played, the same tune he thought he had heard in the cemetery. The next day, it was sitting on his desk, open, though he had left it on the floor. Matt got a torn photograph of the Holloway grave. It was old, yellowed, and in the center, the faint outline of a small figure stood, dark-eyed and staring. Jenna found a child's shoe in her apartment, small and worn, sitting perfectly clean despite the mud and grime outside. Realizing the cemetery had marked them, they decided they needed to return, to confront whatever had followed them. On a moonless night, they drove back to Hillcrest, hearts pounding as they stepped through the gate. The cemetery was different now, darker, almost alive. Shadows moved of their own volition, and the air felt thick and heavy, pressing down on their chests. The Holloway grave was waiting for them, the soil freshly disturbed. They saw the child again, standing at the edge of the grave, the broken music box at its feet. More figures emerged from the fog, their hollow eyes watching, whispering and moaning in unison. Ryan took a deep breath. "We're here to leave. We didn't mean to disturb you. Please, let us go." The child tilted its head, then lifted the music box. The melody played again, louder this time, twisted and discordant. The figures recoiled, the moaning rising to an unbearable crescendo. Matt grabbed the photograph and tossed it toward the figures. The instant it landed, the fog swirled violently, and the hollow-eyed figures shrieked, vanishing into the mist. The cemetery fell silent, the oppressive weight lifting. They didn't wait to see if it would return. They ran through the gate, back into the streetlights of their town, shaking and gasping. They never spoke of Hillcrest Cemetery again, but the memories lingered, like shadows clinging to the edges of their vision. Even years later, Ryan would sometimes hear a faint, melodic whisper in the middle of the night, or see a shadow move in the corner of his apartment. Matt and Jenna experienced the same. Whatever had marked them at Hillcrest Cemetery had not left entirely. It waited, patient, in the darkness, watching, ready to reach out again if curiosity ever led anyone too close. Story, the end. It was a late October evening when I decided to drive out to Evergreen Cemetery, a place I'd heard rumors about my entire life. I grew up in a small town in Pennsylvania, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and stories about haunted locations were passed around like family gossip. Evergreen was said to be the most active, the one that always gave people chills. My cousin Lisa had warned me not to go alone, but I was determined to see it for myself. I had always been skeptical about ghost stories, chalking them up to imagination and fear of the dark. That night, I would reconsider everything I thought I knew. The sky was overcast, and the air had a damp, almost metallic smell. Fog had already begun rolling in, thickening the fields around the cemetery. I parked my car near the entrance, the gravel crunching under the tires as I stepped out. The iron gates creaked as I pushed them open, and I felt an odd heaviness in the air, like stepping into another world. The cemetery was enormous, older than I expected, with rows of tombstones stretching back farther than the eye could see. Many were cracked and leaning at odd angles. Some had moss growing thick across their faces, erasing the names and dates. I pulled my jacket tighter and started down the main path, flashlight in hand. The beam illuminated the narrow trail, but the fog swallowed everything beyond a few feet. I noticed the tombstones with unusual frequency, too many of them broken or toppled, some with dark stains that could have been water, but something about the way they spread unnaturally across the ground made me uneasy. I was about halfway through the cemetery when I first heard it. A soft rustling, almost like someone walking through dry leaves. I froze, trying to convince myself it was the wind or a small animal, but the sound was deliberate, close, and moving toward me. I swung my flashlight in the direction of the noise and caught a glimpse of a figure between two old oaks. It was faint, like a shadow, moving quickly, but it disappeared before I could focus on it. Heart pounding, I kept walking. The stories I'd heard came back to me, about people seeing figures standing among the graves, whispers in the dark, and some who never returned. I kept telling myself it was just my imagination, amplified by the darkness and fog. But then I heard it again, a faint sobbing, soft at first, coming from somewhere ahead. I followed the sound cautiously, my flashlight shaking slightly. It led me to a section of the cemetery I hadn't noticed before. Here, the tombstones were older, some crumbled entirely, and thick vines curled around the stones like grasping hands. In the middle of this area was a small, flat gravestone, almost buried under leaves. I knelt to read it. Clara Hensley, 1878 to 1894. The sobbing seemed to grow louder as I looked at the name. Suddenly I felt it, a cold pressure against the back of my neck, like someone or something was right behind me. I spun around, flashlight sweeping over the fog, but there was nothing there. Then I heard the whisper, "Leave." The voice was faint, barely audible, but it was unmistakably human. My pulse jumped and I stumbled backward. The sobbing escalated, now surrounding me, coming from every direction at once. It wasn't one voice, it was many, layered over each other, all mournful, all desperate. I dropped to my knees, covering my ears, trying to shut it out. That's when I saw her. A young girl, no older than 16, standing just beyond the nearest gravestone. She wore a long white dress, torn and tattered, and her hair hung in wet strands across her face. Her eyes were hollow, dark, and fixed on me. The sobbing seemed to emanate from her directly, though I realized it wasn't just her. It was as if the cemetery itself was crying through her. I couldn't move. My body refused to respond. She tilted her head slightly, and I felt a pull in my chest, like an invisible hand pressing down on me. The fog thickened around her, and the air grew icy. I could see my breath, but the cold wasn't coming from the night. It was coming from her. "Why are you here?" she whispered, her voice trembling with grief and anger. I'm just visiting," I managed to say, my voice cracking. "I didn't mean to disturb you." Her head tilted further, and for a brief moment she smiled, though it was a sad, haunting thing. Then she vanished. I stumbled backward, gasping for air, only to find the fog swirling unnaturally, forming shapes, figures of men, women, and children, all transparent, all crying, some reaching for me with skeletal hands. My flashlight flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced along the broken tombstones. I turned to run, but the path seemed to stretch endlessly before me, the exit nowhere in sight. The figures moved closer, whispering names I couldn't recognize, all desperate, all accusing. I stumbled over a root and fell hard onto the ground, my flashlight skittering across the stones. When I finally looked up, she was there again, standing directly in front of me. The sobbing intensified, vibrating through my chest, and she reached out a hand. I scrambled to my feet and bolted blindly through the cemetery. The figures were all around me now, their whispers deafening, their presence suffocating. I didn't stop running until I burst through the iron gates and into my car. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Once the engine roared to life, I sped down the gravel road, not daring to look back. Even in the safety of my car, I could feel it. Her presence lingering, following, as if the cemetery itself had marked me. The town lights ahead finally appeared, but I didn't slow down until I reached my uncle's house. I slammed the door behind me, heart hammering, soaked in sweat, unable to speak. The next morning, I tried to rationalize what had happened. The cemetery in daylight seemed harmless, ordinary even. The broken gravestones, the old trees, the fog that had seemed alive. It was all explainable, I told myself. But the memory of her eyes, hollow and sorrowful, and the unbearable weight of the sobbing haunted me. I never went back to Evergreen Cemetery at night, but even years later, I sometimes wake to the sensation of icy fingers brushing my arm or hear faint whispering outside my window. Friends have told me I imagined it, that grief and fear can manifest in strange ways. But I know what I saw, what I felt. The cemetery, the girl, the spirits, they are real. And they are still there, waiting for anyone who dares enter after dark, waiting for someone to listen. Story the end. It was just past midnight when my friends and I decided to visit Oak Ridge Cemetery. I had grown up in a small town in upstate New York where everyone knew everyone and ghost stories were a common pastime. Oak Ridge was one of those places people whispered about, the kind of cemetery that had graves dating back to the 1800s, with iron gates that creaked like the voices of the dead. Locals said it was haunted, but as teenagers, we were reckless enough to think haunted meant fun to explore. My friends, Eric, Julia, and I parked a block away on the deserted road and approached the gates on foot. The streetlights didn't reach the cemetery, so all we had were flashlights and the moon, pale and half hidden by clouds. The air was heavy with fog, and the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves wrapped around us as we stepped inside. The entrance was overgrown with ivy, the iron gates rusted and sagging. As we pushed through, the gates groaned like a living thing protesting our intrusion. The path leading into the cemetery was narrow and uneven, flanked by old gravestones tilted at odd angles, some broken, some missing completely. Moss and lichen covered the names carved into stone, making it impossible to read most of them. "Creepy as hell," Julia whispered, her breath visible in the cold night air. She tightened her jacket around her and followed Eric and me down the path. I had brought a small digital recorder, thinking it would be funny to capture any ghost sounds. Eric had his phone out, trying to film, though he complained about the lack of light. Julia didn't bring anything, just walked quietly behind us. We reached the older section of the cemetery, where the stones were small, some no taller than a child. It was quiet, except for the occasional rustle of branches. I noticed a faint outline of a mausoleum tucked behind a stand of twisted oak trees, its door slightly ajar. "That's weird," I murmured. Eric laughed. "Perfect spot for a ghost." I wasn't laughing. Something about the air there felt different, thicker, colder. I shivered, wishing I had worn gloves. "Come on, let's check it out," Eric urged. We approached the mausoleum slowly, and as we did, I noticed the ground looked disturbed near the entrance, like someone had recently dug in the soil. My stomach tightened. Maybe we shouldn't," I said, but Eric waved me off. "Don't be a wimp. It's just an old tomb. Nothing's in there but dust and skeletons." I wanted to believe him, so we stepped inside. My flashlight barely illuminated the interior, revealing dust-covered stone walls and a single sarcophagus in the center. The air smelled musty, and a faint draft carried the scent of damp soil. Then I heard it. A whisper, so soft I thought I imagined it. "Get out," I froze. Julia grabbed my arm. "Did you hear that?" Eric laughed nervously. "It's just the wind." But the whisper came again, closer this time, echoing in the small mausoleum. "Get out!" We all stopped, the hairs on my arms standing straight up. I wanted to turn around and run, but curiosity rooted me to the spot. Julia tugged on my sleeve, fear evident in her eyes. "Eric, I think we should go," she said. He finally stopped laughing and looked around. "Yeah, maybe." We left the mausoleum, but the feeling of being watched followed us. The air seemed heavier, and shadows appeared to move in ways that didn't match the flashlight beams. Every step we took echoed unnaturally. We decided to stick to the main path, but as we walked, we heard it again, the whispering, now coming from behind the mausoleum. It wasn't wind. It was deliberate. I turned slowly, and in the corner of my eye, I saw a figure. A woman, pale, thin, and wearing a long dress that seemed ripped and aged beyond recognition. She floated just above the ground, her face obscured by dark hair. I gasped. Julia grabbed my arm, and Eric shone his flashlight directly at her. The beam passed through her as if she were made of smoke. She tilted her head and let out a low, hollow moan. Then she disappeared. We didn't speak for several seconds, trying to process what we had seen. My hands shook, and the recorder in my pocket felt heavy against my chest. "Let's go," Julia whispered, her voice trembling. We turned to retrace our steps, but the path didn't look the same. Shadows stretched and warped, and gravestones we hadn't noticed before seemed closer than they should be. Panic rose in my chest. Then I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, behind us. I spun around. No one was there. "Keep moving," I said, more to myself than to the others. As we walked faster, the whispering returned. Not just one voice now, but many, overlapping, chanting softly, almost singing. The words were indistinguishable, but the tone was mournful and angry. Suddenly, Eric tripped over something and fell hard to the ground. When he looked up, his flashlight illuminated a small child's grave, marked with a simple cross. The ground around it was freshly disturbed, and small footprints, bare, tiny, led toward us and then stopped abruptly. Julia screamed. We shouldn't be here. I grabbed both of them, pulling them along, but the air seemed to thicken, slowing our movements. The whispering turned into crying, soft at first, then loud, anguished, filling the entire cemetery. Ahead, the iron gates were visible. Relief surged through me, and I ran toward them, pushing my friends along. But as we neared the exit, I felt a cold hand brush my shoulder. I froze, and the crying intensified, surrounding us, coming from every direction. We stumbled through the gate, and once outside, the sounds vanished. The night was quiet again, except for our ragged breathing. We didn't speak until we reached the car, parked a few blocks away. Eric sat in the driver's seat, hands shaking on the wheel. Julia leaned against the door, pale, and I realized my heart was still pounding uncontrollably. I saw her," Julia finally whispered. "I saw her too," I admitted. Eric didn't say anything. He just started the engine and drove away, fast. For weeks afterward, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I would hear whispers when I was alone, faint crying in the dead of night, and shadows moving at the edge of my vision. I stopped going near cemeteries, but the memories stayed with me. Months later, I played the audio from the recorder. There were faint whispers in the background, soft and indistinct, but unmistakably human. And in one section, I clearly heard the words, "Get out, leave now." I never returned to Oak Ridge Cemetery. I never planned to. And sometimes when the wind howls through my small town, I swear I can hear her, the woman in the long, tattered dress, calling my name, waiting in the shadows, mourning and angry. No one in town talks about what happens after dark in Oak Ridge, but I know. I saw it. I heard it. And I felt it. Story the end. The first time I heard the story of Granger Hollow Cemetery, I didn't believe any of it. People in rural Pennsylvania love their ghost tales the way they love their hunting stories. Loud, dramatic, puffed up things always told after dark. I used to roll my eyes whenever the locals swapped stories about lights drifting between the pines or the sound of someone crying near the oldest graves. But the summer my cousin Mark died, everything changed. Granger Hollow wasn't just a piece of superstition anymore. It was the one place I kept being drawn back to, no matter how much it unsettled me. Mark and I grew up like brothers, same school, same baseball team, same trouble we'd get into when we were teenagers, sneaking beers behind the barn. When he wrapped his truck around a sycamore that June, I didn't cry. Not at first. I felt like the world had misfired, like someone had turned a page too soon. His parents buried him in the family plot at Granger Hollow, next to 3 generations of Barlows. I lived only a mile away, and in the weeks after the funeral, I found myself walking there almost every evening, like it was some strange obligation I couldn't put into words. The cemetery itself was old, Civil War old, wedged between dense woods and an abandoned rail spur. The gate was rusted and permanently stuck open, the stone arch cracked along one side. Most of the headstones leaned or tilted, some nearly swallowed by earth. There was a caretaker once, decades ago. Now the township only mowed twice a year, leaving the place overgrown, tangled, forgotten. I kept my visits short. I'd stand over Mark's grave, say nothing, then head home before the sky lost color. But sometime in late July, right after the fireflies started appearing, I noticed something strange. Each time I came back, Mark's flowers had been rearranged, not replaced, just moved. Sometimes the small American flag his father stuck in the soil had been pushed flat against the headstone. Sometimes the bouquet was shifted from one side of the marker to the other. Once, the vase itself had been tipped over and set upright again, like someone had been fiddling with it. At first I figured it was animals, or the wind, but when I found the small tin cross his little sister had left, originally tied to the vase, sitting directly in the middle of the headstone like it had been placed there, not dropped, something in me tightened in a way I didn't like. 2 nights later, I stayed longer than usual. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted to prove to myself that everything had an explanation. The air was muggy, the kind of heat that clings to you like wet fabric. I listened to the crickets, to the low buzz of mosquitoes around my ears. Then, as the sky faded into a deep bruised blue, I heard it. Soft footsteps, not in the woods, not near the fence, behind me. I turned fast enough to make the grass crunch under my shoes, but no one was there, just rows of stones and the long shadows stretching across them. The footsteps must have been mine, echoing weirdly, I told myself. The place plays tricks. Sound bounces, animals move. Everything in a cemetery is meant to feel strange. That's the whole point. But the feeling stayed with me, a prickling between my shoulders like someone standing too close. I started heading out, my strides quickening with every step toward the gate. About halfway there, right past the old Baxter headstone, the one with the angel missing both arms, I caught something in the corner of my eye. A flicker of white, like a piece of cloth slipping behind one of the graves. My breath snagged. I wasn't the kind of person who's scared easy, but that moment lit something cold in the back of my throat. I kept walking, though every instinct told me to run. When I finally reached the road, I didn't look back. That night, sleep didn't come easy. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that soft white flicker, the movement, the quickness of it, almost human. Around 3 a.m., I got up for water, and as I passed the living room window, I froze. Through the trees, down the road, past the bend, you could faintly see the cemetery gate. And for a split second, I swear I saw something pale standing right there beneath the arch. I blinked hard. Gone. A hallucination, I told myself. A trick of moonlight. But the dread settled deep. 2 days later, I decided to go back. Not at dusk this time, but broad daylight. If anything was wrong, I'd see it clearly. That's what I told myself, at least. When I arrived, the sun was bright and unkind, glaring against the stones. I walked straight to Mark's grave, expecting to find the flowers shifted again. But this time, something new waited for me. A small, smooth stone placed dead center on top of his name. Not from the gravel path, not one of the dark, jagged ones that lay around the site. It was white, round, polished, like a river stone. Someone had carried it there. I knelt and picked it up. It was warm from the sun, but something about it made my stomach twist. Why would someone leave a stone? We weren't Jewish, and even then, you don't leave polished river stones on graves in rural Pennsylvania. The nearest river with stones like that was 5 miles away. My first thought was that someone in town was messing with me. Some bored kids, maybe. But I couldn't shake the feeling that the footsteps from before were connected. I pocketed the stone, maybe out of spite, maybe because it felt like evidence. Walking back toward the gate, I heard a low thump, almost like someone stepping heavily on soft ground. My heart spiked. I stopped, listening. The cemetery fell still. No breeze, no birds, nothing. I turned slowly. Between two tall obelisks near the back fence, something moved. A shape, tall, thin. Pale, or maybe wearing something pale. Watching me, I stood frozen so long my legs started to ache. The figure didn't move, didn't sway. It just stood there, half hidden behind stone, as though waiting for me to notice it. The moment I blinked, it was gone. I left without looking again. That night, the air felt too warm in the house. The shadows felt too heavy. Around midnight, a noise woke me. A faint tapping on the living room window, so soft it almost blended with the wind. Except there was no wind. I lay still, staring at the ceiling, barely breathing. The tapping continued, slow and deliberate, like someone testing the glass with a fingertip. Tap, tap. I forced myself to get up. My body moved without permission, compelled by some awful need to know. I stepped into the living room. The tapping stopped. I approached the window, each step careful, terrified of what I might see. The porch light cast a dim glow across the yard, but I didn't turn it on. I didn't want to see too clearly. I reached the window. The glass was cold beneath my palm. Outside, nothing moved. But on the sill, resting neatly against the wood, was a second white river stone. I didn't sleep at all. The next morning, I drove into town and cornered old Mrs. Heller at the diner. She used to be friends with the former cemetery caretaker before he died, and if anyone knew anything, it was her. When I mentioned Granger Hollow, the color drained from her face. "You shouldn't be going up there alone," she muttered. "Why not?" She leaned in close, lowering her voice. "There's things in that graveyard that don't stay in the ground." I almost laughed, but the tremor in her voice stopped me. she went on. There was a girl once, a young woman, buried near the back fence long time ago. Died under odd circumstances. Folks said she walked after dark. Visitors complained about someone standing over them, watching, crying. Some said she left stones behind, like she wanted people to know she was there. What was her name? I asked. Mrs. Heller looked away. Doesn't matter anymore. That grave was never marked right. Storm knocked the stone down years ago. No one knows which plot is hers now. My skin crawled. I left the diner shaken, but stubbornness, stupid stubbornness, pushed me back to the cemetery that evening. I had to see for myself, had to understand. When I arrived, the sky was gray, heavy with clouds. The gate groaned as I passed through. I headed straight for the back fence where I'd seen the figure. The grass was higher there, the stones older, some broken, some swallowed by earth. I searched for any sign of a fallen marker, any hint of an unmarked grave. Nothing looked unusual until I found the third stone. It rested near a stump, half hidden in the grass. Same size, same smoothness, same unnatural whiteness. My heart thudded. I picked it up, and the second my fingers closed around it, something cold brushed the back of my neck. Not wind. Fingers. I spun around. She stood 3 feet away. A woman, or what used to be a woman. Her dress was old, white once, now gray and tattered. Her hair hung in wet ropes around her face. Her skin, what I could see of it, was pale as candle wax, stretched too tight. Her eyes were the worst, wide, dark, and full of a sorrow so heavy it pressed the air around her. Her mouth trembled. "You took them," she whispered. My pulse hammered. My breath came in sharp, painful bursts. I couldn't speak, couldn't move. She took a step toward me, her bare feet silent against the grass. "They're mine." I stumbled back, nearly tripping over a stone. I didn't know. Her face twisted into something agonizing, like a scream trapped inside silence. "He won't come." Her voice fractured, thin as cracked glass. "I leave them, and he won't come." I didn't understand, didn't want to understand. She reached toward me, and the air around her dropped to freezing. My legs finally obeyed. I ran, blind, panicked, crashing through the rows of graves. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. When I reached my truck, I tore out of there so fast gravel spit behind the tires. At home, I threw the stones into the woods behind the house. All 3 of them. I didn't care where they landed. I just wanted them gone. That night, the tapping returned. Not at the window, on the front door. Soft at first, then harder. I sat on the floor with my back pressed against the couch, heart thundering, praying it would stop. It didn't. 10 minutes. 20. Then silence. I dared to stand, dared to look through the peephole. On the doormat lay a single white river stone. I moved out 2 days later. I never went back to Granger Hollow. Not even to say goodbye to Mark. His parents probably think I abandoned him. Maybe I did. But every now and then when I'm walking to my car before dawn or taking the trash out at night, I get the feeling someone is standing just out of sight, watching. And every once in a while, beneath a tree or beside the driveway or on the porch railing, I'll find a smooth white stone resting in a place I know I didn't leave it. Story the end. The first time I ever heard about the strange things happening at Sandbury Grove Cemetery was in the fall of 2019 when I was working as a survey assistant for the county. The job mostly meant long days hiking through woods, abandoned property lines, and old municipal sections marking drainage paths and documenting structures no one had touched in decades. Sandbury Grove, a small cemetery tucked behind a line of maple trees off a rural road in southwest Michigan, was one of those places. Technically, the county needed to assess soil conditions around parts of the cemetery where recent floods had washed out nearby trails. But for me, the name carried a different weight. It was the place people in town mentioned in lowered voices, the one with the stories everyone swore were true but never explained in full. I wasn't someone who believed in ghosts. I'm still not sure what I believe, but I'll tell you exactly what happened, exactly as I experienced it, and you can decide for yourself. Sandbury Grove was founded around 1880, although most of its earliest graves had been washed away in storms long before my time. Only a few original markers remained, leaning crookedly in the far northwest corner under pine needles thick enough to smother footsteps. Newer sections had been added over the decades, modest plots and polished granite stones scattered without much order. The place wasn't large, maybe 2 or 3 acres. Still, walking through it gave me the uneasy feeling that it went farther than it appeared, as if each path twisted into something unseen the moment my back was turned. The first time I went there for work, it was early afternoon. Even then, the cemetery had an uncanny hush. No wind moved through the trees. No birds called. It felt as if the air itself was waiting for something. My partner for the day, a guy named Neil who'd grown up in Sandbury, didn't help the tension. "You ever hear the stories?" he asked as we passed the first set of newer graves. "No," I said, "but I'm guessing you're about to tell me." He shook his head. "Not a chance. I'm not repeating any of that out here." "You believe in that stuff?" "I've seen enough," he muttered. "Just stick close." I laughed at him then. Hours later, I wouldn't be laughing. We worked our way to the northwest corner. Leaves covered most of the ground, the color of rusted copper. Our boots pressed into the wet earth. The sky overhead dimmed unexpectedly, though no storm was forecasted. The air grew colder. I zipped my jacket and kept measuring coordinates. Then I heard it. Something soft. A breath? A whisper? It came from behind us. I spun around, but no one was there. Just crooked stones with faded names, lichen-covered and half-buried. "What was that?" I asked. "Don't answer it," Neil said sharply. "Answer what?" He only shook his head again and kept working, but his face had gone pale. A few minutes later, while noting soil depth near an older iron fence, I noticed something odd at the corner of my vision. A woman standing between two old pines. Her dress looked white or gray, I couldn't be sure, but unmistakably old-fashioned, flowing around her as if stirred by wind none of us felt. I blinked, and she was gone. I didn't say a word to Neil. He had already tensed up, scanning the trees like he expected someone to step out. We finished our survey faster than I thought possible and left without speaking. The moment we stepped back through the rusted cemetery gate, the wind returned. Birds sang somewhere nearby. It was as though the world had resumed after holding its breath. I told myself it was just shadows, exhaustion, imagination, anything rational, but I knew what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen. Over the next month, I went back to Sandbury Grove 2 more times. The second visit was uneventful. I almost convinced myself the first day had been a trick of nerves and poor light, but the third time I went alone, and that's when things changed. It was early November, a gray morning with mist drifting low to the ground, the kind of atmosphere that sinks into your bones. I had to recheck some readings because county officials were worried about water seepage near the cemetery's western boundary. I parked along the narrow dirt road, grabbed my equipment, and walked up the path. Inside, everything was quiet again, far too quiet. No crunch of twigs from squirrels, no hum of insects, even though it wasn't cold enough to silence them, just that same breathless stillness. I worked quickly, marking lines and depths, sketching a map. For almost an hour, nothing unusual happened. My confidence grew. Maybe this place just had a strange atmosphere. Plenty of old cemeteries did. Then I heard footsteps behind me, slow, deliberate pacing across dead leaves. I smiled to myself, relieved. It had to be a deer or another survey worker. But when I turned around, I saw her, the woman in the pale dress, standing those same 2 pines where I'd spotted her the first time. This time she was closer. I could see the outline of her face. Her skin looked gray. Her hair fell long and dark over her shoulders. She wasn't quite looking at me, more like looking past me, or through me. My first instinct was to call out, ask if she needed help. But something about her expression, blank, hollow, made the words stick in my throat. She wasn't supposed to be there. She didn't belong to the moment, to the day, or maybe even to the world. I stepped backward. She stepped forward. Not with the normal motion of a person walking. More like she glided, her feet not fully touching the ground. The mist gathered around her ankles as if drawn toward her. My breath caught. Suddenly the air grew icy, colder than the November morning should have allowed. My fingers stiffened around my clipboard. A sound drifted through the cemetery. A woman's voice, faint but close, whispering words I couldn't distinguish. I wanted to run. Everything in me screamed to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The figure stopped about 20 feet away. Her head tilted slightly, as if she were listening to something behind me. Then her eyes, dark, sunken, shifted and locked onto mine. She raised her hand and pointed to the ground, directly beside me. I dropped my clipboard, stumbled backward, and glanced down. It was a grave, an old one, the stone half sunken into the earth. The name, though worn, was still readable: Margaret Hensley, 1891 to 1913. I crouched, reading the date again, and the cold deepened. Margaret had died young, only 22. Something twisted in my gut, an instinctive, awful feeling that her death hadn't been peaceful. When I looked up again, she was gone. The leaves rustled for the first time that day, as if released from whatever force had held them silent. I grabbed my things and left in a hurry. But when I reached the gate, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The mist had parted enough for me to see footprints on the path behind me. Not mine, not boot prints. Bare feet, small, spaced lightly, as if someone had walked just moments ahead. I didn't go back for 2 weeks. Eventually, though, work forced me to return. The county wanted a complete assessment before approving new drainage trenches. I didn't tell my supervisor what I had experienced. What would I say? That a ghost pointed at me? That the dead were restless? I'd have been taken off the assignment or laughed out of the office. So I returned on a chilly late afternoon, just before dusk. I brought a flashlight this time, and a thermos of coffee to steady my nerves. As soon as I stepped inside the cemetery, I felt it again, that unnatural quiet. But something else hung in the air too, tension, like static before a storm. My goal was simple: get in, finish the last set of measurements, and get out before nightfall. I walked straight to the northwest corner, avoiding the trees where I'd seen her. I didn't look for footprints. I didn't look for movement. I tried to focus on the work. I'd been there about 20 minutes when I heard a soft sobbing. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal. It was unmistakably human. A woman's voice, trembling, broken. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I turned slowly. The sound came from deeper within the cemetery, near a cluster of old stones where the ground dipped slightly. The sobbing grew louder. I didn't want to go toward it. Every instinct told me to leave. But something else, a strange pull, a feeling almost like obligation, drew me forward. If someone was out there, hurt or lost, I needed to be sure. I followed the sound through the mist. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the graves. Then the crying stopped abruptly. I whispered, "Hello?" No answer. A shape appeared near the base of a bent willow tree. A figure crouched on the ground, shoulders shaking as if crying silently now. Her hair flowed over her face. The pale dress looked exactly the same as the other times. I backed up a step. "Can you hear me?" I asked. Her head jerked upward, not gradually, violently, as if yanked. I stumbled. Her face was fully visible now. Empty eyes, bruises around her neck, dark and unmistakable. Lips parted as if forming a word. My flashlight flickered. Then she moved, not toward me, but past me, gliding so close I felt the cold radiating from her. She drifted toward the gate, then stopped suddenly and turned back. Her hand rose, pointing again, but this time not at the ground, at me. A whisper slithered through the air, clear as day. "Help!" I staggered backward, nearly falling. She drifted toward the old pines again, then vanished completely. The cold lifted. The birds began calling far off in the woods, and I ran, tearing my way through the cemetery gate without looking back. That night I did something I hadn't considered before. I looked up the name from the grave. Margaret Hensley. There wasn't much information online, but I found an old digitized newspaper snippet from 1913. It described the disappearance of a young woman from Sandbury. Her body hadn't been found for nearly 2 weeks. When it was, it had been discovered near the cemetery, buried in shallow earth, strangled. The case was never solved. I stared at that article for hours. The bruises around the neck, the age, the location, everything aligned far too neatly for coincidence. It seemed she had been trying to show me something, or warn me. I didn't sleep much afterward. But the next morning, something inside me insisted I return, one last time. Not for work, not for curiosity, but because someone who never had justice might still be trapped there. I packed a fresh flashlight, a spare battery, and printed copies of the article. I told no one where I was going. When I arrived, the sun was high, the air clear, the cemetery deceptively peaceful. I went straight to her grave. I stood in front of the stone, the ground soft beneath my boots. The pine branches overhead swayed slightly. "I know what happened to you," I said softly. "I'm sorry." The wind died completely. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then I felt a presence behind me, not cold this time, not threatening, just there. I didn't turn around. Instead, I placed the newspaper article copy at the base of the grave. "You weren't forgotten," I whispered. "Not anymore." The air warmed slightly as if someone breathed out for the first time in a long while. Then the cemetery fell silent again. Not unnaturally silent, just calm. I never saw her again, but sometimes when I drive past Sandbury Grove on my way to other job sites, I swear I feel someone watching. Not in fear, not in warning, in gratitude. I don't know what lingers there or why her spirit reached out to me, but I do know this. Some places hold their history close, and some souls refuse to rest until someone hears them. And once you've heard them, your life is never quite the same. Story the end. The night air was cold, sharper than usual for early October in upstate New York. I had just moved into a small apartment in a town called Millfield, a place with a population barely hitting 3,000. The town was sleepy and quiet, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, but it had a reputation, one I was skeptical of at first. Locals whispered about the old Millfield Cemetery tucked at the edge of a forest on a hill, a cemetery that no one really went near after dark. Stories of strange noises, shadows, and unexplained disappearances made the rounds whenever newcomers dared to ask. I never believed in ghosts. I didn't. Not until the night I decided to see the cemetery for myself. It started with a dare. My neighbor, an older man named Tom, had been sharing stories over a few beers one Friday evening. His eyes glimmered with a mix of fear and pride as he recounted how he once saw a figure walking among the gravestones, moving against the wind. "But you'll never catch it," he said, slamming his bottle on the table. "It only appears when you least expect it, and it follows you home sometimes." I laughed. I told him I'd go see for myself. I parked my car at the bottom of the hill around 10 that night. The road up to the cemetery was barely more than a gravel path, lined with old oaks whose branches formed twisted, claw-like patterns under the moonlight. The wind made them creak, and I shook off a small sense of unease. My flashlight cut a thin line through the dark, bouncing across weathered stones and cracked markers. The air smelled damp, like earth and decaying leaves. At first, it was just what I expected. Graves, old and new, some with fresh flowers, others overgrown with weeds. The names on the headstones faded with time. Some stones were tilted at odd angles, almost as if they had been pushed or had leaned under the weight of the years. I walked slowly, my footsteps sounding louder than I thought they would. Every so often, I'd stop to peer at a name or date, trying to convince myself I was seeing history, not something sinister. Then I noticed it. A faint figure standing among the graves, barely visible in the beam of my flashlight. At first, I thought it was another visitor. But the closer I got, the more I realized it wasn't human. Its shape was vaguely humanoid, but the edges of its body seemed to shimmer like the air around a hot sidewalk in summer. I froze. The wind picked up, and the sound of branches snapping in the distance made me flinch. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, and yet I felt it watching me. I told myself to move forward, to approach it. My feet were heavy, and my flashlight shook in my hand. Then it was gone. Just like that. 1 second it was there, the next, nothing. I scoured the area, shining my light in every direction, but the cemetery was empty. My heart pounded, but I laughed nervously at myself. Ghosts weren't real. I turned to head back to my car and noticed something strange. The path I had walked in on seemed different. Stones were in places I didn't remember. The trees looked denser, the shadows darker. I thought maybe I had taken a wrong turn, but the gravel path should have led me straight down. Panic settled in, my flashlight flickered. Then I heard it, a soft whisper, almost like someone calling my name. I spun around, heart in my throat, but there was no one there. The whisper came again, this time from behind a row of gravestones. I took a hesitant step forward. "Hello?" My voice sounded small in the empty night. No answer. I told myself to leave, to run back to the car, but my curiosity was stronger than my fear. Something about the whisper drew me forward, past the crooked stones and moss-covered markers. Then I saw a grave unlike the others. The stone was black, polished, and unnaturally new. There was no name on it, just a date, October 30th, 1887. The whisper grew louder, almost a chant now, indecipherable but urgent. My flashlight flickered again and went out completely. In the darkness, I felt a cold breath on my neck, like someone had stepped right behind me. I spun around, but again, nothing. Yet the whisper continued, moving closer. I backed away slowly, fumbling with my flashlight until it flickered back to life. That's when I saw them. dozens of figures emerging from the shadows between the graves. They were translucent, gaunt, dressed in clothing from different eras, some with hollow eyes, others with faces contorted in silent screams. My stomach dropped. I had never felt so utterly terrified in my life. One of the figures stepped forward. It was a man in a tattered suit, his face pale and lips blue. He reached out a hand toward me. "Why are you here?" His voice was like dry leaves scraping across the ground. I stammered, unable to speak. The other figures circled me slowly, their forms flickering like dying embers. I turned and ran, stumbling over roots and broken stones, my flashlight swinging wildly. The whispers grew into a chorus, 1,000 voices calling my name, laughing, half crying, accusing. I could feel them following me, brushing against my arms, chilling me to the bone. I didn't stop until I burst out of the tree line and onto the gravel road. My car was there, just as I left it, but my hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the keys in the ignition. I drove home in silence, not daring to look in the rearview mirror. When I reached my apartment, I locked every door and window, trying to convince myself it had been a hallucination, the stress of moving to a new town, or maybe even the beers talking. But deep down, I knew what I had seen was real. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those figures, felt their cold breath on my skin. Around 3 a.m., I heard a tapping at my window. I froze. The sound came again, slow, deliberate. I peeked through the blinds, and for a moment, nothing. Then, in the reflection of the glass, I saw a pale face staring back at me, eyes hollow, lips moving silently. I slammed the blinds shut and didn't open them until morning. Over the next few weeks, strange things happened. Objects in my apartment moved on their own. I would hear footsteps in the hallway when I lived alone. Most disturbingly, I started to hear the whispers again, low and urgent, calling me back to the cemetery. I told Tom what happened. He nodded grimly. "It chooses who it wants," he said. "Once it notices you, it doesn't let go." I avoided the cemetery after that, but the feeling never went away. Sometimes late at night, I would see shadows moving outside my window or feel cold fingers brushing my shoulder. I stopped going out alone after dark. Friends noticed I had become withdrawn, jumpy, afraid of the quiet. I wanted to move, to leave Millfield behind, but the job kept me here. One night, about a month after my first visit, I couldn't sleep again. The whispers were louder, insistent. Against my better judgment, I got dressed and went outside, drawn to the cemetery once more. I walked up the hill, the gravel crunching under my feet, and there they were, the figures, waiting. They didn't move, just watched as I approached. I saw the black grave again, the one with the date from 1887. The whispering stopped, replaced by a single voice, clear and calm, "You cannot leave." The cold was unbearable now, seeping through my clothes, through my skin, through my very bones. I stumbled backward, tripping over a stone, and everything went dark. When I woke up, I was back in my apartment, the morning sun streaming through the blinds. I had no scratches, no bruises, nothing to show I had been outside at all. But the whispers never left me. Even now, writing this, I feel their presence at the edge of my awareness, waiting for the night, waiting for me to return. I know one thing for certain. Once the Millfield Cemetery notices you, it never forgets. And I have no doubt that one day it will call me back again. Story the end. The night my father finally told me the truth about what happened in the old Greenwood Cemetery was the same night I realized grown adults can be just as scared of the dark as children. He never talked about fear, never admitted to it, not once. So when he sat across from me at the kitchen table, pale and trembling in the dim glow of the overhead lamp, I listened. Not because I wanted to, but because something in his voice said the story had been waiting decades to be spoken. He started with the year 1982, when he was 16, stubborn and restless. Greenwood Cemetery, tucked behind the woods at the edge of Marlow, Indiana, was already the town's oldest and most avoided place. People said the graves were sinking. People said the fog there was thicker than anywhere else. People said the dead were loudest at midnight. My father never believed in ghost stories back then, but he did believe in impressing his friends. And that's how he ended up agreeing to spend a night inside the cemetery, alone, with nothing but a lighter, a pocket knife, and a stubborn streak too wide for his own good. He took a breath before telling me the rest. His eyes kept drifting toward the back door as if something still lingered outside, even after all the years between. I didn't move. I didn't ask questions. I just listened. He told me the gate was already open when he got there. Rusted hinges, half-broken lock, ivy crawling along the iron bars like it wanted to keep people out, or keep something in. The air was damp and cold, though it was late July. The moon hung low and yellow between branches that reached like crooked fingers. The cemetery felt older than the town, older than the road leading to it, older than the woods surrounding it. The trees leaned inward as if listening. He spent the first hour walking around to prove there was nothing to be afraid of, as he put it. My father laughed a little at that. Not a real laugh, but the kind someone uses to hide something else behind it. He told me the first strange thing he noticed was how quiet everything was. No bugs, no leaves rustling, no owls. The kind of silence that presses on your ears, not because sound is absent, but because something is swallowing it. He found a large stone angel in the center of the cemetery, one wing broken, head tilted, expression weathered to something almost sad. He sat beneath it and waited, flicking his lighter on and off to keep his nerves down. At some point he dozed off. He woke to footsteps, slow, uneven, dragging, not coming from the gate, not from the woods, from behind him. He turned around, expecting his friends to be playing a prank. Instead, he saw a figure standing 3 rows back, halfway hidden between headstones. The shape was faint in the moonlight, but he could tell it was tall, lean, shoulders slumped forward, like a man who had been walking a long time. He called out, thinking it was some drifter, or maybe the groundskeeper. The figure didn't move, didn't speak, didn't even seem to breathe. Then, very slowly, it stepped forward. He told me it wasn't the way the figure moved that scared him. It was the sound it made, the exact sound he'd heard before waking, dragging, as if one foot couldn't lift off the ground. My father stood up, gripping his lighter like it was a weapon. He shouted, warning the figure to stop. Instead, it kept coming, and the moon hit the figure's face just enough for my father to see it wasn't a face at all, but a hollow shape, like a black cloth pulled over a skull. He ran. He didn't look back, not even once. He just kept sprinting through the rows of graves between tilting headstones toward the gate that looked so far away he thought he might not make it. The air grew colder with every step, so cold his lungs burned, so cold his fingers numbed instantly. Something followed him. He heard it clearly. Dragging, scraping, getting faster. He told me that's when he made the mistake of turning around. Just for a second. Just enough to see the figure was no longer walking. It was gliding. The bottom half hovered inches above the grass, and the dragging sound came from its hands, if you could call them that, scraping along the ground like long, bony hooks that carved into the earth. He almost didn't make it to the gate. He stumbled, hit the ground hard, and felt breath on the back of his neck. Only it was too cold to be breath, he said. Colder than anything he'd felt before. It seeped through his skin into his bones. He got up and threw himself through the gate, rolling onto the gravel road outside. The moment his body crossed the boundary, the dragging stopped, and silence returned. But before he stood up, he heard a voice. Just one word, whispered from behind the bars. Stay. My father didn't stop running until he got home. The next morning, he went back with 2 of his friends to retrieve his dropped lighter. They found it sitting in the exact spot he'd awakened to the footsteps. But the ground around it, the grass, the dirt, the roots, was carved with long, deep lines, as though something had clawed its way across the earth. They never went back. For many years, he didn't think about it. He grew up, got married, had me. Life moved on, but sometimes he said his nightmares would take him back to that moment, lying on the ground, hearing the cold breath behind him. The story would have ended there if not for what happened last week. My father's voice shook when he told me this part. He rubbed his arms like he was trying to warm himself from the inside out. He said he was driving home late one night, near that same cemetery, only because the main road was blocked off for repairs. He hadn't taken that route in years. He didn't realize where he was until he saw the rusted iron gate through the trees. The gate that was supposed to be locked. But it wasn't. It was open, just slightly, just enough to see inside. As he slowed the car, something pale moved in the darkness between 2 headstones. A faint glow, no shape, no definition, just light. Then he heard it again, Dragging. He hit the gas so fast his tires kicked gravel behind him. He didn't look back until he reached the end of the road, and when he did, the gate was closed again. He told me he hadn't slept since. Not well, anyway. Every night he hears that dragging sound outside his window, sometimes closer, sometimes farther. Sometimes so near he swears whatever is making the sound is just on the other side of the glass. I didn't know whether to believe him, not until last night. I woke up at 3 in the morning to a strange noise outside my room, a soft scraping, a slow dragging. At first, I thought it was a branch against the siding. Then I remembered we don't have trees near the house. The sound grew louder, dragging. I lay there frozen, heart pounding so hard the mattress shook. Another drag, another scrape, closer this time, like something moving along the hallway floor outside my door. I didn't get up, I didn't call out. I just listened, praying it was my father, though some part of me knew it wasn't. The sound passed my room, slow and heavy. Not footsteps, dragging. I held my breath until the sound reached the end of the hallway and stopped. Silence. Too much silence. I waited 15 minutes before I dared move. When I opened my door, nothing was there. But something was different. The air was freezing, so cold I could see my breath in the hallway. My father's door was cracked open. I pushed it wider and found him sitting up in bed, pale as the moonlight spilling across the room. "You heard it," he whispered. I nodded. "It followed me home," he said, voice trembling so badly he could barely speak. "I think it's been looking for me since that night in '82. He told me he doesn't know what it wants. He only knows it keeps getting closer and it won't stop, not until it gets inside, not until he goes back, and he refuses to go back. Tonight, as I write this, he's asleep on the couch downstairs, too afraid to sleep alone in his room. I can hear the wind outside, but underneath it, barely audible, I hear that dragging again. Not from the yard, from inside the walls. I don't think it's after him anymore. I think it knows about me now. I don't know how long we have before it finds a way in, or what happens when it does. But if tomorrow comes and the house is silent, too silent, and someone finds this, then whatever was in Greenwood Cemetery didn't stay there. It followed us home. And it's still here. Story the end. I'd been working the night shift at Greenwood Cemetery in rural Pennsylvania for almost a year, and I'd grown accustomed to the quiet, the kind that isn't just silence. It's a heavy, lingering presence that presses on your chest if you let it. Most nights were uneventful, filled with trimming grass, checking the perimeter, and occasionally shooing away curious teenagers who thought cemeteries were a place for dares. But that October night changed everything. It started just after 9 p.m. The fog had rolled in early, thick and sticky, clinging to the ground and the trees around the older section of the cemetery. The older section was the part nobody wanted to go near. Headstones leaned at impossible angles, names were half erased, and the earth smelled of decay in a way that didn't belong to the surface. I was finishing up trimming around an old family plot when I heard it. A soft, dragging sound coming from between two leaning markers. I froze, convinced it was the wind. But the sound grew louder, deliberate, like something, or someone, was moving across the ground, just out of the flashlight beam. "Hello?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. My hand gripped the pole of the trimmer tighter than necessary. No answer. I slowly stepped closer to the sound. The beam of my flashlight danced over cracked stones and frost-tinged grass, and then I saw it, a man crouched by one of the graves. His clothes were torn and filthy, like he'd been lying in the dirt for days. His hair was matted, hanging over a face I couldn't fully make out in the darkness. What froze me wasn't just the sight, it was the way he moved. His motions were jerky, unnatural, like a marionette with broken strings. I swallowed hard. "Sir, are you okay?" He didn't respond. Instead, he lifted his head slowly, and the moonlight revealed his eyes. Empty, hollow, black pits that seemed to absorb the light rather than reflect it. My stomach dropped, and I instinctively took a step back. That's when I realized the shadows weren't just shadows. Around him, the fog swirled unnaturally, forming shapes that twisted like hands reaching for the ground. I wanted to call out again, to run, to do anything, but my body was frozen. Suddenly, he straightened. The sound of his bones cracking echoed in the still air. And then, as if pulled by some invisible string, he turned and slowly started moving toward me. I finally found my voice. "Stop! Stay back!" It didn't stop. His pace was slow, deliberate, almost casual. But there was a certainty in the way he moved, a weight behind each step that made the ground feel like it was trembling. I turned and ran, tripping over a sunken headstone, my flashlight swinging wildly. The fog seemed to thicken, curling around my legs, slowing me down, tugging at my clothes. Behind me, I heard it. Laughter. A low, guttural sound that rose and fell like wind over a canyon. Not human laughter. Wrong. Alien. Bone deep. I scrambled to my truck at the far end of the cemetery. My keys rattled in my hands as I fumbled to unlock the door. My eyes darted around, but there was nothing there. Nothing visible. Just the fog, but I could feel it. Watching. Waiting. I slammed the door shut, locked it, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the fog, and I drove off the gravel path without looking back. The next day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd left something behind. Something in that older section. I told Richie, the supervisor, about what I'd seen. He listened quietly, then looked at me with that same solemn expression he always had when I pushed too far into the cemetery's history. "You saw her, didn't you?" he asked. "Her?" He nodded slowly. "Margaret Hill. She's been here a long time. People say she was buried alive by mistake. They found her in a family plot on the hill, frozen solid, her hands stretched out like she was trying to grab something." I felt my skin crawl. That's a story, right?" Richie shook his head. "No story. Real. It happens every few years. Someone sees her or hears her. Sometimes it's a shadow, sometimes a voice, sometimes, well, worse. People don't talk about it much. Folks die, leave the town, or quit jobs at the cemetery. Nobody stays long enough to get used to her." That night, I went home but couldn't sleep. Around 2 a.m., I heard a soft tapping on my window. I froze, staring into the darkness. My apartment was on the second floor. Nothing could be there. And yet, the tapping came again. 3 taps. I swallowed hard and stayed completely still. Then silence. The next morning, I checked my yard. No footprints, no branches moved, just frost patterns on the window that hadn't been there before. The hand-like impressions stretched across the glass, branching in ways that reminded me of veins. I scrubbed at them, but the patterns wouldn't fully come off. Weeks went by, and the experiences didn't stop. Each night brought a new terror, whispers of my name through the walls, faint shadows moving past closed doors, sudden cold spots that would freeze the air around me. I tried to convince myself it was stress or exhaustion or some combination of the two. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. One night, I returned to the cemetery under the guise of checking equipment. The fog was heavier than before, rolling across the graves in thick, undulating sheets. I walked through the older section, my flashlight beam cutting through the haze. And then I saw her. Margaret Hill. She knelt by a crumbling headstone, her dress dragging through the wet grass. Her face was turned away, but I recognized her immediately. Her head lifted slowly, and her eyes locked on mine. Hollow, black, endless. Her hand reached toward me. I ran, faster than ever, heart pounding in my chest. The fog thickened around her, forming hands, faces, and shapes that weren't human, all reaching for me. When I reached my truck, I slammed the door and started the engine. As I drove off, I dared a glance at the rearview mirror. She stood at the edge of the fog, watching me leave. The mist curled around her like smoke. I quit the cemetery 2 days later. I moved to a different state, hoping distance would keep her away. But some nights, when the wind shifts and the fog rolls in low, I still see her. I still hear the tapping, the whispers, the dragging sound of those broken limbs through the grass. A year after I left, I got a call from Richie. He said they'd found a new body in the older section of Greenwood Cemetery. Another worker had seen a shadow moving and decided to investigate. What they found was a man, frozen in the same posture Margaret had been in when she died. His eyes wide, staring, and a hand stretched out as if reaching for someone who wasn't there. He survived the night, but he didn't remember how he got there. Just the shadow, the fog, and the whispers. I still live in another state, far from Greenwood Cemetery, but sometimes at night I wake to frost on my windows, tapping against the glass. Sometimes I hear a whisper of my name, soft and urgent. I've tried to tell people, but who believes a story like this? People laugh, call it stress or bad dreams. But I know the truth. Margaret Hill is still out there, waiting, watching, patient. She isn't bound by a cemetery or a town or even time. She moves with the living, seeking warmth she lost long ago. I can't escape her, and I don't think anyone ever truly does. Story, the end. I still remember the first time I went to Hillcrest Cemetery alone, though I wish I could forget it. I had just started working as a night security guard at a small factory on the outskirts of Detroit, Michigan, and my shift ran from midnight to 8 a.m. Most nights were uneventful, just me pacing the lot, checking doors, and logging the occasional truck delivery. But that December night changed everything. It was around 2:30 a.m. when my patrol took me past Hillcrest. The cemetery had been abandoned for decades, a mix of old marble headstones, crumbling family mausoleums, and overgrown paths choked with weeds. Streetlights barely reached the gravel entrance. Most of the area was lit only by the pale wash of moonlight. I had driven past Hillcrest plenty of times, always noticing the silence and the thick blanket of fog that seemed to linger. But that night, something felt different. I parked my car at the edge of the cemetery, mostly out of curiosity. I had a flashlight in my coat pocket, but I didn't expect to need it. The fog was thin at first, just brushing the tops of the grass and curling around the bases of the stones. I stepped out, the gravel crunching under my boots, and immediately noticed how still everything was. No wind, no rustle of leaves, not even the usual hum of a distant highway. Just silence. As I walked between the graves, the air seemed to thicken. I passed a small, tilted headstone that read Mary Whitaker, 1897 into 1915. Her name caught my eye, and for a brief second, I thought I saw something move out of the corner of my vision. I spun around, but there was nothing, just the fog swirling slowly around the base of the stones. I shrugged it off and continued down a narrow path lined with broken concrete markers. That's when I noticed a shadow ahead, standing perfectly still in the fog. It was too tall to be a child, too slender to be any normal person. I froze, my breath fogging in the cold night air. The figure didn't move, didn't blink, and its face was obscured by the darkness of the fog. "Hello?" I called out, trying to sound braver than I felt. No response. Just the thick silence pressing in around me. I took a cautious step forward, and the shadow shifted slightly. Not like a person walking, more like it had been watching me and had now decided to acknowledge my presence. My gut tightened, telling me to turn back, but something made me step closer. The figure raised a hand slowly, pointing toward a grave further down the path. I squinted through the fog and saw a freshly disturbed patch of soil in front of a small, crumbling tombstone. The name was barely legible: Samuel Greaves, 1932 to 1987. But the soil looked new, as if someone had been there recently. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. The fog thickened instantly, swirling around my legs and ankles. I shivered violently, my flashlight slipping from my coat pocket to the ground. I bent down to grab it, and when I looked up again, the figure had moved closer, just a few feet away. I couldn't make out a face, but I could feel it staring at me, its presence pressing in, heavy and oppressive. Then I heard it, a whisper, low and raspy, coming from nowhere and everywhere at the same time. "Go." I stumbled back, heart hammering, and the figure vanished into the fog as if it had never been there. My first thought was that I was imagining things. Exhaustion, stress, a trick of the moonlight on fog. But my instincts told me otherwise. Something wasn't right. I decided to leave, and as I turned back, I noticed something else. Footprints in the frost. Not my own, not any animal I recognized. They were barefoot, small, and they led from the freshly disturbed grave straight toward the mausoleum at the back of the cemetery. Curiosity overcame fear. I followed the prints, flashlight now in hand, shining over the old stones. The mausoleum was old, iron doors rusted shut, a pile of dead leaves at its base. The footprints ended at the door. I knelt to examine them and froze when I saw a handprint. Not just a mark, but a print like someone had pressed their entire hand into frost-covered metal. And it was still wet. A sudden noise made me jump. It was faint at first, a scraping like nails dragging over concrete. Then it came again, louder, echoing from inside the mausoleum. My stomach turned to ice. I shone my flashlight through the rusted iron bars, but I couldn't see anything, only darkness. Then a faint shape emerged inside, a woman in a tattered dress, her face pale, eyes sunken, hair long and black, hanging over her shoulders. She was moving slowly toward the front, raising her hands as if reaching for me. I stumbled backward, heart racing, and tripped over a gravestone. The flashlight went out. Total darkness swallowed me. I scrambled to turn it back on, hands shaking, and when I finally did, she was gone. I didn't wait to investigate. I ran to my car, jumped in, and locked the doors. I sat there trying to catch my breath, staring at the cemetery, and that's when I noticed it. She was standing at the edge of the fog just beyond the iron gate, watching me. Her lips moved, but no sound came. Then she raised a hand and pointed at me again, and the fog swallowed her completely. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been followed. At work, I kept seeing shadows out of the corner of my eye. Doors that were supposed to be locked were slightly ajar. On my lunch break, I drove past Hillcrest Cemetery again, and I could swear I saw her standing by the same grave, her black dress blowing slightly in a breeze that didn't exist. I told my cousin Mark what happened. He didn't seem surprised. He only said, "She finds people who come close to her family plots. She doesn't mean to harm. She wants to be remembered." I didn't understand at the time, but I think I do now. Over the next few weeks, I started researching Hillcrest Cemetery. Old obituaries, town records, even newspaper archives. Many of the graves were of people who had died tragically young. Some were missing children. A few listed deaths with no explanation, just the years and the names. And then I found her. Her name was Lillian Harper. Born 1895, died 1916. She had lost her family in a fire when she was a teenager. Rumors said she had wandered the cemetery for weeks after their deaths, refusing to leave, speaking to no one but the dead. Some townspeople claimed she had been buried in the family plot, but the dates and records didn't add up. After that, I started keeping a notebook. Any night I was forced to drive past Hillcrest, I recorded strange happenings. Whispered voices, shadows that seemed too human to be shadows, fog that moved against the wind. Over time, patterns emerged. The old family plots were the places she lingered most. And always there was a warning or a plea, never a threat. One night, about 2 months later, I was driving home around 1 a.m., and the fog rolled in thick and fast. My headlights barely penetrated the haze. As I approached the cemetery, I saw her again, standing just inside the gate. I stopped the car. She didn't move at first, just stood there, staring. Then she lifted a finger, pointing to a small tilting gravestone near the back of the cemetery. I got out, curiosity and fear mixing, and walked to it. The name had been worn away by time, but the ground in front of it was fresh, disturbed earth. I felt a chill, almost like a warning. And then I heard it, her voice clearer than ever. "Remember me." I nodded, unsure if she could see me. And for the first time, the feeling that had pressed on me during every encounter, the heaviness, the despair, lifted slightly. She faded into the fog slowly, leaving only silence and a cold breeze. Since then, I've driven past Hillcrest only in daylight, and I never enter. But I know she's still there, wandering among the graves of the forgotten, reaching out to anyone who comes close. She isn't evil. She just wants to be remembered, wants the dead to have someone who notices, someone who hears them. Sometimes when I can't sleep, I picture her in the fog, standing silently by a gravestone, waiting. And I can't help but think that if I ever ignored her warning, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. Hillcrest Cemetery isn't haunted in the way movies make it out to be. There's no screaming, no violent spirits. It's haunted by memory, by loss, by someone who refuses to be forgotten. And when you walk among the graves, alone in the fog, it's impossible not to feel her presence. I don't know how many others she has reached out to over the decades, or what happens to those who ignore her. But I do know one thing: she is real. And if you ever find yourself in Hillcrest Cemetery after dark, don't be surprised if she's watching, waiting, reminding you that even the dead need someone to remember them. Story the end. It was the kind of night that makes small towns feel smaller, the darkness pressing down between the streetlights, the air thick with the scent of damp leaves and rotting wood. I had grown up in Milltown, Ohio, a place where everyone knew everyone, and the stories of the old cemetery on the hill had always been whispered, never spoken out loud. Locals called it Pinewood Cemetery, but to anyone who had been there past dusk, it was something else entirely. Haunted, cursed, alive in a way that made the living uncomfortable. I never believed the stories. My friends and I would dare each other to go there when we were teenagers, shouting through the cold night air, our flashlights bouncing over headstones, our laughter echoing off the old trees. But now, 10 years later, I found myself driving up the narrow, cracked road that led to the cemetery, the only light coming from my headlights cutting through the fog. I was looking for my sister, Emily. She had called me earlier that evening, voice trembling, saying she needed to see the graves before something happened. She didn't explain what. She just sounded afraid. When I got to her apartment, she wasn't there. I called her phone, straight to voicemail. Her car wasn't in the driveway. Panic pushed me toward the one place she might go. The one place she always went when she wanted to be alone and think. Pinewood Cemetery. The gate to the cemetery hung crooked on its hinges, the paint peeling like scabs. I parked and stepped onto the gravel path, my flashlight cutting through the fog like a knife. The cemetery was vast, older than anyone in town could remember. Some of the gravestones leaned at odd angles, their inscriptions faded to the point of illegibility. Moss crept over the older stones like the earth was trying to reclaim them. I called her name. The sound of my own voice made my stomach twist. No answer. Only the occasional rustle of leaves in the cold wind, a sound that somehow seemed too deliberate. I walked deeper, past the newer graves with fresh flowers, past the neat headstones of families who still visited regularly. The air felt heavier the further I went. I thought about turning back, about going home and calling the police, but something inside me kept me moving forward. I had to find her. It started as a soft tapping. Tap, tap, tap. Not loud, but enough to make my hair stand on end. I froze, listening, my flashlight swinging wildly. It sounded like someone tapping on stone, a slow, irregular rhythm. My rational mind told me it could be a branch hitting a gravestone or maybe an animal knocking against something, but the sound was too deliberate, too human. "Emily?" I called, my voice catching. No answer. The tapping stopped. The sudden silence was worse, pressing against my ears, my chest. And then I heard a whisper. Soft, almost imperceptible. It didn't carry words I could understand, but it had a rhythm, a cadence, a sense of warning. I turned a corner, heading toward the oldest section of the cemetery. Here, the stones were jagged and uneven, some almost completely sunken into the earth. I had to step carefully, my flashlight beam cutting across shadows that seemed to move just beyond its reach. And then I saw her. Emily. She was kneeling at a grave, hands pressed to the ground, hair falling over her face. I called out to her, my voice cracking, but she didn't move. Not a muscle, not a glance. "Emily!" I ran toward her, my shoes crunching on the gravel. As I approached, I saw her head lift slowly. Her eyes, they weren't right. They were wide, dark, and unseeing, staring past me as if looking through the world. Her lips moved, whispering something I couldn't hear, a chant of syllables that made my skin crawl. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the cemetery, and I felt it on my neck, sharp and unnatural, like icy fingers brushing against my skin. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me, coming from every direction at once. My flashlight flickered, then went out. Darkness swallowed me, and panic surged. "Emily, come on, we have to go!" I grabbed her arm, but she didn't respond. The air grew thick, almost viscous, pressing against my chest. I stumbled back, pulling her to her feet. And that's when I saw it. A figure emerged from between the gravestones, tall, impossibly thin, dressed in white that seemed to glow faintly in the fog. Her hair was long and black, hanging straight and damp over her shoulders. Her face, I don't know how to describe it. It wasn't human, not fully. Her mouth hung slightly open, and I could see nothing. No eyes, just hollow darkness where they should have been. Emily froze, staring at the figure, whispering its name. I tried to drag her back, but it was like her feet were rooted to the ground. The figure took a slow, gliding step toward us. Tap, tap, tap. The sound of its fingers brushing against stone echoed through the cemetery, unnaturally loud. I screamed at Emily, finally breaking whatever hold had her in place. She stumbled toward me, and I grabbed her hand. Together we ran, sprinting through the fog, the gravel crunching under our feet. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until we burst through the cemetery gate, gasping, covered in sweat, even though the night was freezing. We didn't speak on the drive home. Emily held my hand tightly, staring straight ahead. When we got back to her apartment, she collapsed on the couch and refused to move. I called the police, but when they arrived and we explained where we had been, they found nothing. No figure, no whispering, no sign of anyone. Just the cold, empty cemetery, quiet as if it had never been disturbed. That night, I slept in Emily's apartment. I stayed awake, listening, heart hammering. Around 3 a.m., I heard it. Tap, 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 coming from the window. My flashlight illuminated nothing but the street outside. I didn't breathe. I didn't move. The tapping stopped. Silence. Weeks passed. Emily refused to go near the cemetery again. I tried to convince myself it had been a hallucination, stress, fear magnifying shadows, but I knew better. Every night, I hear her whispers in my dreams, hear the tapping just outside my bedroom window. Sometimes when the wind is right, I swear I can feel her. No, it's not Emily, watching me, standing just beyond the trees in Pinewood Cemetery. I never go there. I tell people I don't believe in ghosts, but I can't shake the feeling, the certainty, that whatever is in that cemetery waits for someone to stray too close. Waits to remind the living that some graves are not meant to be disturbed. I drove past it last week just to see. The fog hung heavy even though it wasn't misting anywhere else in town. The gates were still crooked. Shadows shifted between the stones, too deliberate, too alive. And for a moment I saw her, or it, standing at the edge of the tree line, staring directly at me. I haven't been able to sleep properly since. Every night in the dead hours I hear it. Tap, tap, tap. I tell myself it's the house settling, the wind, anything. But I know it's not. I know it's waiting. I know it's real. And I know that someday, if I'm foolish enough, I'll go back to Pinewood Cemetery. But I also know when I do, I won't come back the same. Maybe I won't come back at all. Story the end. The cemetery at the edge of Willow Creek had always been quiet. Almost too quiet. I first heard stories about it when I was a kid, growing up in rural Ohio. People whispered about strange lights that appeared between the headstones at night, and about a woman in white who wandered the rows, crying. Most of the time, I shrugged it off. Ghost stories were just a way to scare kids. That changed the summer I was 23, the summer I lost my brother. My brother Ryan had been struggling for years with depression. One evening in late June, he disappeared. We found him the next morning in a ditch near the creek. It was quick, sudden, and brutal. I wasn't prepared for the emptiness that followed. My parents decided to bury him in the family plot at Willow Creek Cemetery. I didn't argue. I wanted to be close to him, even if it was just his grave. The cemetery itself was nothing like the manicured parks you see in the movies. It was overgrown, the grass long and tangled, gravestones leaning at odd angles. Some had crumbled entirely, and moss had claimed the older markers. The gate was a rusted iron affair that creaked whenever the wind blew, and there were no lights except for a single dim street lamp at the road's edge. By the time Ryan was laid to rest, the sun was setting, and the shadows in the cemetery stretched long and dark. That first night after the burial, I couldn't sleep. My mind kept returning to the cemetery, to the thought of Ryan lying there, alone among the broken stones. Around midnight, I heard a faint sound outside my bedroom window, like someone was crying. I froze. The sound was soft but persistent, a low, heartbreaking sob. I told myself it was the wind, that I was imagining things, but the sobbing continued for hours, and I couldn't convince myself it was nothing. The next evening, I went to the cemetery alone. I didn't know why. Some part of me needed to see him again. The sky was overcast, the last light fading behind thick clouds. I walked the gravel path past the older graves, past the ones I remembered from childhood stories. The Wilsons, the Carters, families long gone. When I reached Ryan's grave, I noticed something strange. The flowers I had left earlier in the day were gone. Not wilted or blown over, but gone. The soil was disturbed, freshly turned. My heart sank. I looked around, half expecting to see someone, anyone. But the cemetery was empty. Only the wind whispered through the trees. I knelt at Ryan's grave, brushing my fingers over the disturbed dirt. That's when I saw it. A small, white handkerchief, neatly folded, lying on top of the mound. I didn't recognize it, but it felt wrong, like it didn't belong there. I picked it up, and a chill ran through me. The air grew colder instantly, as if the night had pressed closer. I didn't stay long. I left quickly, my flashlight shaking in my hand. The moment I reached my car, I thought I saw a figure moving between the graves. A woman in white standing perfectly still. I blinked, and she was gone. My stomach turned over. I drove home in silence, heart pounding. That night, the sobbing returned. This time, it wasn't outside the window. It was inside my house. Soft at first, then louder, echoing through the hallways. I tried to ignore it, but eventually I couldn't. I grabbed a flashlight and walked through the house, every shadow twisting into something threatening. When I reached the living room, the sobbing stopped. I shined the flashlight across the room, and for a moment I thought I saw her, just a glimpse of white slipping behind the curtains. My pulse raced, and I ducked, retreating to my bedroom. The following day, I tried to rationalize everything. It had to be grief, exhaustion, imagination. But when I returned to the cemetery, the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. I walked past Ryan's grave and noticed more disturbances. Footprints in the soft dirt, small rocks arranged in circles around certain headstones. I followed them, trying to find some logical explanation, but there was none. The deeper I went into the cemetery, the more I felt it, an almost physical pressure, like invisible eyes tracking me from every shadow. As the sun dipped lower, I reached the back of the cemetery, near the old section where the oldest graves were. That's when I saw her clearly, a woman, pale and thin, wearing a tattered white dress. Her hair hung in wet strands over her face. She stood perfectly still, watching me. I froze, unable to move, unable to breathe. Then she lifted her head, and I saw her eyes, dark, hollow, filled with a grief so raw it made my chest ache. She started moving slowly toward me, her bare feet silent on the grass. I ran without thinking, stumbling through the graves, not daring to look back. I didn't sleep that night. When I finally drifted off, I dreamt of the cemetery, of Ryan's grave being dug open, and of her standing over him, weeping. I woke in a cold sweat, convinced she had followed me home. Over the next week, I couldn't stop thinking about her. I asked the locals about the cemetery, about the woman in white. Most just shook their heads, muttering that old places carry old spirits. One elderly man, Mr. Hay Jennings, told me about a woman named Clara Benson who had drowned her child in the creek over 100 years ago. She had wandered the cemetery ever since, looking for her lost child, appearing to anyone who came near. He said she wasn't harmful, but she was relentless. Grief kept her tethered to the world of the living. I wanted to believe him, but when I returned to the cemetery, I didn't see the soft, ghostly figure I expected. I saw anger, desperation, something almost tangible in the way the shadows moved. I could feel her watching, following my steps, whispering my name in the rustle of the leaves. One night I decided to stay at the cemetery until dawn. I parked near the entrance, flashlight and blanket in hand, heart hammering. Hours passed slowly. The moon peeked through the clouds, casting silver light across the graves. Then I heard it. The sobbing. Clear, persistent. I followed the sound to the back, where the oldest graves lay, crumbling and forgotten. There she was, the woman in white, standing over a small, unmarked grave. I couldn't see her face clearly, but I could feel her anguish radiating like heat. She raised her arms toward me, and I understood. Not threat, not anger, but pleading. She wanted me to see, to know, to remember. I knelt by the grave and brushed away the dirt and leaves, revealing a small stone marker, weathered and cracked. It read, Maria Benson, 1902. The woman cried out softly, a sound that seemed to shake the trees, then turned and disappeared into the shadows. The sobbing stopped, the air felt lighter, and for the first time in weeks, I could breathe without fear. I never saw her again after that night, but I still visit Ryan's grave, leaving flowers and sometimes a small white stone, just in case. And whenever I pass the old cemetery gate at dusk, I feel it, the faint, lingering presence of grief, of someone searching for what they lost, reminding me that some things don't rest easily, even after death. Story the end. It was late October when I first noticed something strange about the cemetery behind Maplewood Church in rural Ohio. I had grown up in the area, but rarely walked near it after sundown. The place had a reputation among the locals. Nothing violent, just unsettling. People whispered about shadows that moved on their own and unexplained sounds that carried through the fields. I never paid much attention until that night. I had stayed late at my friend Tom's house. We were teenagers, 15 and 16, bored, restless, and looking for something to do. Tom suggested we take a shortcut through the cemetery to get home faster. I hesitated, mostly because of the stories, but eventually curiosity and peer pressure won. The sun had just set when we climbed over the old wrought iron gate. The cemetery was empty, silent, except for the occasional creak of the swinging gate we had left behind. Rows of weathered gravestones stretched out like broken teeth, some leaning, others cracked, with moss creeping up their surfaces. The ground was uneven, and our flashlights only revealed a few feet in front of us. The mist was settling in low, curling around the bases of the stones like ghosts themselves. Tom laughed nervously. "You're going to tell me you're scared already?" "Not scared," I lied, my voice cracking slightly. As we walked further in, I began to notice how cold it had become. It wasn't just the temperature dropping, it was a sharp, biting cold, the kind that sinks into your bones. Our breaths fogged in the air. The sound of our footsteps seemed louder than normal, echoing off the stones in strange, distorted ways. Then we heard it. A soft, almost imperceptible whispering. At first I thought it was the wind rustling through the trees. But the whispering didn't sound like wind. It sounded like voices, female voices, quiet, sorrowful, calling out in tones that were almost pleading. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Tom stopped, shined his flashlight around, but nothing moved. The mist made it hard to see more than a few feet ahead, but the shadows between the graves seemed to thicken, to shift. "It's just the wind," Tom said, though even his voice sounded uncertain. We kept walking, but the whispering grew louder, closer, and now there was something else. A faint sobbing, slow and heart-wrenching. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I froze. Tom noticed and grabbed my arm. Let's just get out of here," he said, voice shaking. I nodded, but as we turned to leave, the sobbing stopped. The silence that replaced it was worse, heavy, oppressive, almost tangible. Then we heard it again, clearly this time, a name, whispered from right behind us. "Jason." I spun around, shining my flashlight into the mist, but there was nothing. My heart started pounding. Tom and I exchanged a look, and we began running toward the gate. The air grew thicker, the mist curling around us, making it feel like we were running underwater. Then something ran past me, brushing against my shoulder. I screamed and stumbled, hitting the ground. Tom yelled and grabbed my arm, pulling me up. When we finally reached the gate, we stopped, gasping. The cemetery behind us seemed calm again, the fog slowly thinning as if nothing had happened. But the memory of that whispering name lingered in my mind, echoing even after we left. The next day, I tried to put it out of my mind, chalking it up to fear and imagination. But things didn't stop. Objects in my room began moving on their own. Small things at first, like my backpack sliding off the chair or a pencil rolling across the floor. Then, at night, I started hearing soft sobbing outside my window. Not distant, it sounded like it was right under my bedroom. It escalated over the next week. I began to see shadows moving just beyond my vision, out of the corner of my eye. The whispering voices became clearer, more urgent, and always calling my name. I couldn't sleep. My parents thought I was stressed from school, but I knew it was the cemetery. One night, unable to take it anymore, I decided to go back. I grabbed my flashlight and my jacket and walked down to the cemetery alone. The streets were empty, the town quiet. When I reached the gate, I hesitated, the memory of the previous night's fear pressing against me. But something inside me, fear, curiosity, guilt, I couldn't tell, pushed me forward. Inside, the cemetery was eerily still. The mist had returned, thicker than before, curling around the stones. I followed the path toward the old section where the graves were oldest. My flashlight flickered, and I thought I saw movement, a figure, pale, standing among the graves. I froze. Then it moved closer. A woman, tall and thin, dressed in a white gown that seemed to glow faintly in the mist. Her hair was dark and wet-looking, hanging in front of her face. She didn't walk. She glided above the ground. I couldn't move. My flashlight fell, spinning across the dirt and illuminating her face just enough to see her eyes. Hollow, black, endless. "Why are you here?" she whispered. The voice was faint but carried an unbearable weight of sadness. I don't know," I stammered. She tilted her head, and I saw that her lips were cracked, her skin gray, almost decayed. She raised a hand, pointing toward a cluster of graves near an ancient oak tree at the center of the cemetery. My stomach dropped. I felt an instinctive knowledge, like my body already understood what she wanted. I stepped toward the graves, trembling. There were no names on them, at least none I could read. The ground was disturbed, fresh soil piled over the markers. I realized, with a jolt of horror, that she wanted me to know something about these graves. The woman whispered again, almost inaudible, "Help! Find them!" I had no idea what she meant, but the air grew heavier, colder, pressing against me like water. Shadows thickened around the graves. The whispers multiplied, overlapping into a chorus of voices, all pleading. I fell to my knees. "I don't know how," I shouted, my voice breaking. Suddenly, a wind picked up, blowing through the cemetery like a living thing. The woman's face softened, and the shadows seemed to pull back slightly. She reached out one hand, and I felt a cold, sharp touch on my shoulder. Not violent, but commanding, insistent. "You must tell them," she whispered. Before I could respond, she vanished. The mist evaporated almost instantly, leaving the cemetery bathed in moonlight. The graves were still there, but the pressure, the voices, were gone. The silence was absolute, suffocating and peaceful at the same time. I left the cemetery that night and ran home, never looking back. But the experience stayed with me. I researched the cemetery, the graves, and found the story of a woman named Eliza Whitman who had lost her children to disease in the late 1800s. Locals had said she wandered the cemetery at night, grieving, crying, calling out for her children until she herself died alone. I realized then that the woman I saw was Eliza, still trapped in her grief, still bound to the cemetery, and she had chosen me in some inexplicable way to witness her sorrow. I never went back after that night. But sometimes when the wind is right and the mist rolls down the hills, I swear I hear soft crying in the distance, accompanied by a whisper of my name. I know it's Eliza, still wandering, still pleading. And I know, somewhere deep inside, she's waiting for someone else to help her find peace. Even now, years later, I avoid that road after dark. The cemetery is quiet during the day, innocuous to anyone who passes, but at night it holds its secrets tightly. I've told very few people what happened, because who would believe me? And yet, every time I drive past, I feel it. The pull of the mist, the sorrow in the wind, the faint trace of a hand brushing against the edge of my shoulder. I've tried to forget it, tried to convince myself it was a dream or a trick of the mind, but some nights, in the quiet of my room, I can still hear the sobbing, and I know, deep down, it's waiting, calling, never gone. Story the end. I had grown up hearing stories about Maplewood Cemetery, the oldest cemetery in our town of Millfield, Ohio. Locals said the place was haunted, that people who wandered in after dark sometimes didn't come back the same, or at all. As a teenager, I thought it was all just superstition, the kind of tales that get passed down to scare kids. But that fall night in 2008 changed everything I believed. I was 16, and my best friend Ryan had dared me to meet him at the cemetery at 11 p.m. He claimed he had proof that the place was haunted. I knew better than to go alone, but peer pressure is hard to resist at that age, and my curiosity was worse. I grabbed my jacket, a flashlight, and my phone, though the battery was nearly dead. The walk to Maplewood Cemetery was cold and damp. The town had recently been hit by rain, and the leaves on the sidewalks were wet and crunchy under my feet. The cemetery sat on a low hill behind the old Methodist church, and as soon as I passed the wrought iron gates, the temperature seemed to drop at least 10 degrees. Fog hugged the ground, curling around the old stones like smoke. Ryan was already there when I arrived, crouched near a small mausoleum that leaned slightly to one side. He looked pale, but his eyes were wide with excitement. "Did you see it?" He whispered. "See what?" I asked, though I was already uneasy. "There's a light inside the mausoleum. I swear, it flickers like a candle, but no one's been here in years. Come on, check it out." I hesitated. The mausoleum's door was iron and rusted. Ivy crawled over the edges, and the entire structure seemed to sag under the weight of its age. I knew people had died inside centuries ago. Many, according to the cemetery's oldest records. "We'll just look," Ryan said, sensing my fear. "We'll leave right after." Against my better judgment, I agreed. We crouched down and pushed on the door. It groaned under our weight, but didn't budge. That's when the air changed. The fog thickened, curling around us, and a cold breeze swept past my neck. "Did you feel that?" I asked. Ryan nodded, swallowing hard. "Yeah. Weird, right?" A soft, scraping noise started from inside the mausoleum. I froze. It was slow, deliberate, like someone, or something, was dragging its fingers along the stone floor. Ryan shined his flashlight through the crack in the door. The beam flickered and revealed a pale hand pressing against the interior wall. Long fingers, almost skeletal, stretched as though reaching for us. I gasped and stumbled backward. "Let's go," I said, voice trembling. Before we could move, the hand retracted and a low moan filled the air. The sound was not human. Not entirely. It carried a tone that made my skin crawl and my stomach twist. We ran. Branches scratched our faces, roots snagged our feet, and every step echoed unnaturally in the cemetery. When we finally reached the main gate, both of us were shaking, gasping for breath. I dared to glance back, but the mausoleum appeared empty, dark, and still, as if nothing had happened. I didn't sleep that night. The memory of that hand, those long fingers, haunted me. But the terror wasn't over. 2 nights later, I was at home when my mom called me downstairs. She said a neighbor wanted to speak with me. On the porch stood a woman I had never seen before. She was old, frail, with a pale, lined face and eyes that seemed too dark for her age. "I know what you saw at Maplewood," she said without greeting. Her voice was soft but firm, like someone who has delivered this message hundreds of times. "You have to stay away from the cemetery. Don't go back after dark. The spirits there, they follow." I don't understand," I stammered. "They notice the living," she said. "They notice curiosity. If you return, you risk bringing them home with you." She turned and left without another word. Her warning stuck with me, but, of course, curiosity is a powerful thing. A month later, Ryan called me again. He said he had found something in the cemetery, a grave marker he wanted me to see. Against my instincts, I agreed to meet him. The cemetery was quiet, almost too quiet. The fog had rolled back a little, but the temperature was still cold, and the air had that strange metallic scent I remembered. Ryan waved me over to a section near the back, the oldest part of the cemetery. "This one," he said, pointing to a stone barely legible with age. The name read Lillian Hart, 1884 to 1902. The stone was cracked and covered in moss, yet something about it seemed recent. Fresh scratches marred the surface, like fingernails had scraped across the stone. I bent down to look closer. That's when I saw the footprints. Small, muddy, human-shaped footprints leading away from the grave toward the woods. Only they weren't mine or Ryan's. I didn't recognize them, and they ended just short of the next row of stones, disappearing into nothing. "That's impossible," I said. Ryan's flashlight flickered, then went out completely. The cemetery plunged into darkness. Then I heard it, the soft shuffle of feet moving between the graves, slow, deliberate, circling us. "Ryan?" I whispered. He didn't answer. A cold hand grabbed my shoulder. I spun around, heart in my throat, but no one was there. Only the fog swirled, thick and heavy, as if alive. The air smelled of earth and decay, and faint whispers floated around me. Not words I could understand, just moans and sighs carried on the wind. I stumbled backward, tripping over a root. The whispers grew louder, forming one sound that was almost human, a laugh, high-pitched, brittle, echoing across the stones. Then I saw her. A girl, pale as paper, standing between 2 gravestones. She couldn't have been older than 12 or 13. Her dress was torn, gray, and muddy at the hem. Her hair was long and black, hanging in front of her face. She tilted her head to one side, staring at me without moving a muscle. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. Ryan grabbed my arm, shaking me. "Move! Now!" I finally broke free and ran toward the gate. The fog thickened, clinging to my skin, slowing me down. I could hear the girl following, her soft footsteps gliding just behind mine. I didn't look back. I didn't stop. We burst through the cemetery gate and didn't slow until we reached the streetlights on Main Street. Only when we were safely among the houses did I dare glance back. The girl was gone. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't tell anyone. People would have said I was exaggerating or imagining it. But that night I found muddy footprints outside my bedroom window, small, child-sized, leading from the corner of the house to the bushes. They were gone by morning, but I knew what I had seen. Over the years, the sightings continued in smaller ways. Lights flickered in my room, shadows passed in the corners of my vision. I would wake up to find white flowers on my porch, lilies, always, though I had no idea who could have placed them there. I eventually moved out of Millfield, but every time I return for a visit, I feel it again. The stillness, the cold, the weight of watching eyes. My friends who still live there avoid the cemetery entirely, whispering about the restless dead and the girl in gray. Some nights I can still hear her laughter in my dreams, soft and brittle, calling my name, reminding me that curiosity has a price. Maplewood Cemetery is just a place of stones, some say, but I know better. I've felt it, I've seen it, and I will never, ever go back after dark. Story the end.